The chamber aboard the Iquitas felt colder than usual. Perhaps it was the sterile glow of the overhead lights, or the silence that pressed against the walls like a vice. Captain Carolyn leaned back in her seat, feigning a confidence she didn't fully feel. Across the obsidian table sat Commander Zalrek Theron, his massive frame casting a long shadow in the room's artificial light. His slit-pupil eyes studied her with the precision of a predator evaluating prey. The two had met before, in battles fought across light years. Zalrek had been the face of the enemy for years, his name whispered in dread among human troops. Now here they were, trying to negotiate peace after decades of mutual devastation. "Shall we begin?" Zalrek's voice was gravelly, his tone a careful mix of authority and disdain. His clawed hand rested on the table, motionless but threatening in its stillness. Kara smiled faintly, tilting her head. "We could start with formalities. Or," she said, folding her hands, "we could skip straight to the stories." Zalrek's jaw tightened. "Stories? You seem curious about us," she said, her voice light but laced with an edge. "I've noticed it during these meetings. You certain think you know us. You see humans as crude, unpredictable, dangerous." She leaned forward, her tone softening, almost conversational. "Want to know why?" Zalrek's eyes narrowed. "Your unpredictability is well documented. Reckless, desperate acts of survival. We have studied them." "Oh, you've studied them." Kara chuckled, shaking her head. "Let me tell you, Commander. There are things about humans you can't learn from data." She paused, letting the silence settle like an anchor. "Let's start with the Great Martian Siege." Zalrek's posture stiffened. He'd heard of it, of course. It was a pivotal moment in the war, a turning point. But hearing it from a survivor's mouth was something else entirely. Kara's voice took on a distant tone as she began. "It was the year 2563. Mars, one of our oldest colonies, was under siege by your kind. Our orbital defenses had been shredded, our cities bombarded into rubble. Supplies were cut off. What food we had left wouldn't last a month. The CERN calculated we'd surrender within 6 weeks. That calculation was accurate," Zalrek interjected, his voice clipped. "Your survival was unexpected." Kara raised an eyebrow. "Unexpected? That's one way to put it." Her smile faded, replaced by something darker. "We didn't just survive. We endured." She let the weight of that word sink in before continuing. "You see, humans are resourceful when we're desperate. We started rationing water down to drops. People gave up their share to keep the soldiers hydrated. We ate things that would have killed us under normal circumstances, things that would make your scales crawl. But that wasn't the worst of it." Zalrek's claws clicked lightly against the table, betraying a hint of unease. "Continue." Kara leaned back, her expression unreadable. "There were no rules anymore. Every breath was a fight. Families volunteered their own to the meat grinders of war just to give us a chance. My unit, we used the tunnels under the city to stage ambushes. You certain thought you'd crushed us, but the moment your troops set foot on the surface, we became shadows. We melted into the ruins, striking from the dark." She paused, letting the memory wash over her. "But even then, we were losing. We needed something unexpected." Zalrek tilted his head. "Your desperation is not new to us. Your kind is famous for it." Kara smirked, her eyes glinting. "Then you might enjoy this part. When the food ran out, we turned to unconventional tactics." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Your soldiers thought they were safe in the forward bases. They didn't realize the meat they were eating wasn't from your supply chains. It was ours." The CERN commander's expression froze, his reptilian features betraying a flicker of disbelief. You resorted to cannibalism?" "Oh, not at first." Kara's voice was calm, almost clinical. "But when survival's on the line, morality becomes a luxury. Soldiers volunteered their bodies to feed the others after they fell. Some of us knew. Some of us didn't. Didn't matter in the end. It kept us alive. Long enough to sabotage your supply lines. Long enough to drive you off the planet. Zalrek's jaw tightened, the faintest twitch betraying his discomfort. He had known humans were capable of ruthlessness, but hearing it described with such brutal honesty was unsettling. And that, Kara continued, her tone sharpening, was just Mars. Do you want to know about the siege of Europa? Or the pits of Titan? We're very creative when it comes to surviving against the odds. Zalrek's claws clicked again, louder this time. You tell these stories as if you are proud of them. Kara's smile faded. Proud? No. Survival isn't about pride, Commander. It's about necessity. It's about doing whatever it takes to keep breathing, even if it costs you your soul. Her voice softened, almost gentle. That's why you fear us. You CERN are strong, disciplined, efficient. But you don't know what it's like to lose everything. You've never had to claw your way out of the abyss with bloodied fingers. For the first time, Zalrek broke eye contact. His gaze dropped to the table, his claws flexing reflexively. Kara studied him, her expression unreadable. You want peace, Zalrek? I do too. But don't mistake our willingness to negotiate for weakness. If you push us again, if you back us into another corner, humanity will do what it's always done. We'll adapt. We'll endure. And we'll make sure you regret it. The silence that followed was suffocating. Zalrek's chest rose and fell with slow, measured breaths. When he finally looked up, his eyes were harder than before, but something else lingered in them, something he couldn't quite mask. Fear. You speak boldly, human, he said, his voice strained. Perhaps too boldly. Kara shrugged, standing from her chair. Boldness is all we have left. But you should think about what I said. She turned to leave, her boots echoing against the chamber floor. This war's taken enough from both of us. Let's not make it worse. As the doors slid shut behind her, Zalrek remained seated, his claws digging into the table. The stories lingered in his mind like ghosts, whispering of a species that refused to die, no matter the cost. For the first time in his long career, Zalrek felt the stirrings of doubt. And it terrified him. Commander Zalrek Theron sat rigid in his chair, his clawed fingers steepled as he stared at the negotiation table. The human had left the room, but her words lingered like a toxic vapor in the air. His mind replayed the details of her story, the shadows in the tunnels, the eerie calm with which she spoke of turning desperation into survival. He had heard many war stories during his campaigns, but this was different. It was not the brutality that unsettled him, it was the humanity behind it. Commander? The voice of his adjutant, Major Zalvir, interrupted his thoughts. The smaller CERN, younger and less hardened, stood beside him with a data pad in hand. Shall I prepare a response to the human delegation? Zalrek didn't answer immediately. He stood slowly, his massive frame towering over Zalvir. No. Not yet. His tone was clipped, but his usual composure wavered at the edges. They're using psychological tactics, Commander, Zalvir said cautiously, his scaled brow furrowing. Their stories are meant to provoke, to unnerve. They're succeeding, Zalrek muttered, almost to himself. He turned toward the chamber's wide viewport, which offered a view of the barren planet Eridos below. Its rocky surface was pockmarked with craters from centuries of warfare. The sight usually calmed him, reminding him of his victories. Today, it felt hollow. Do you fear them? Zalvir's question was bold, almost insubordinate. Zalrek turned sharply, his yellow eyes narrowing. Fear them? His voice was a low growl. No. But I will not underestimate them again. Zalvir bowed his head slightly, his tail flicking in deference. What should we do, Commander? Zalrek hesitated. For a long moment he said nothing, his thoughts spinning in directions he hadn't anticipated. Finally he spoke. Leave me. I must think. The adjutant nodded and left the room, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. Meanwhile, Kara Lynn sat alone in her quarters, staring at a half-empty glass of water. Her hands were steady, but her mind churned with memories she couldn't suppress. Talking about Mars had brought it all back, the hunger, the screams, the cold determination in her commander's eyes as he ordered them to do the unthinkable. She took a sip, the water tasting bitter on her tongue. Her reflection in the glass stared back at her, weary and hollow. The war had taken so much from her, her family, her friends, her sense of who she was. And yet, here she was, representing humanity in negotiations that might determine its future. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she said, her voice steady. The door slid open, revealing Lieutenant Max Reed, her second in command. He stepped inside, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "That was intense," he said, leaning against the wall. Kara gave him a tired smile. "You think so?" "Zaurek looked like he'd swallowed a grenade," Max said, his tone lighter. But the humor didn't reach his eyes. "You sure about this approach? Pushing him like that?" Kara sighed, setting the glass down. "Max, you've seen what the CERN can do. They don't respect diplomacy. They respect power. Fear. If we want peace, they need to understand what's at stake if they push us again." Max nodded slowly. "I get it. But it's a gamble. You're banking on him cracking, not doubling down." She shrugged. "He's already cracking. Did you see the way his hands shook? He's not as unshakable as he wants us to think." Max hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever wonder if we've gone too far? The things we've done to survive, are they really something to be proud of?" Kara's smile faded. "No," she said softly. "I don't think anyone who lived through it would call it pride. It's just survival. And if that's what it takes to keep humanity alive, I'll do it again." Max nodded, his expression heavy. "Then let's hope Zaurek feels the same about his people." Zaurek, back in his quarters, paced the room like a caged predator. His mind was a battlefield, caught between his pride as a CERN commander and the gnawing unease that Kara's words had planted. He prided himself on understanding his enemies, on predicting their moves. But humans defied understanding. He recalled the siege of Mars vividly. His troops had reported the humans' stubborn resistance, their refusal to surrender even as their cities burned. At the time, he had dismissed it as desperation. Now, he wasn't so sure. "They are not warriors," Zaurek murmured to himself, his voice a low rumble. "They are survivors." His comm device beeped, pulling him from his thoughts. He hesitated before answering. "What is it?" A female CERN voice came through. "Commander, intelligence reports indicate the human delegation's next proposal may focus on joint resource management." "Joint?" Zaurek hissed, his claws flexing. "Do they truly believe we would share resources with their kind?" The voice posed. "It is unclear if their intentions are genuine or another form of manipulation." Zaurek closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. The humans were not to be trusted. But then again, either was his own certainty. "Dismissed," he said curtly, ending the call. He returned to the viewport, his reflection staring back at him. Kara's words echoed in his mind. "If you push us again, we'll make sure you regret it." For the first time, Zaurek considered the possibility that peace might not just be the best option, it might be the only one. Back in the negotiation chamber, the human and CERN delegations gathered for the next round of talks. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Zaurek entered with his usual commanding presence, but those who knew him well noticed a slight hesitation in his step. Kara sat waiting, her expression calm but watchful. She studied Zaurek as he took his seat, noting the way his claws rested just a little too tightly on the table. "Commander," she greeted him, her tone neutral. "Captain," Zaurek replied, his voice steady but lacking its usual bite. The room fell silent as both sides waited for someone to speak. Finally, Zaurek leaned forward, his yellow eyes locking onto Kara's. "Your stories," he began, his voice low, "are meant to provoke. To remind us of your species' resilience." Kara tilted her head. "And? Did they remind you of anything, Commander?" Zaurek's claws tapped the table lightly. "They reminded me that humans are as dangerous as we feared. Perhaps more so." "Good," Kara said simply. Because that's the point. If we're to make peace, we need to understand each other. You don't understand humans yet, Zalrek. But you will. The CERN commander's gaze didn't waver, but something shifted in his expression. It wasn't anger or contempt. It was something quieter. More calculating. We shall see, he said finally, leaning back in his chair. The next phase of negotiations began, but the unease lingered. For both Zalrek and Kara, the stakes had never been higher. And both knew that the fragile truce between their species could shatter at any moment. The negotiation chamber felt like a pressure cooker. Every word spoken between the human and CERN delegations carried the weight of decades of war, and every silence seemed to bristle with unspoken threats. Captain Kara Lynn sat at the edge of her chair, her calm demeanor belying the turmoil in her mind. Across from her, Commander Zalrek Theron was unusually still, his reptilian gaze fixed on her like a predator weighing its options. Kara could feel it. The tension in the room had shifted. Zalrek wasn't just posturing anymore. He was calculating something, but she couldn't yet tell what. You've made your point clear, Captain Lynn, Zalrek said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was a heaviness to his words that made her wary. Humans are relentless. Dangerous. Willing to do whatever it takes to survive. And? Kara asked, keeping her tone neutral but firm. And I find myself wondering. Zalrek continued, his claws tapping lightly against the table. If your species is even capable of peace. The statement landed like a hammer. Kara's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to stay composed. Peace isn't about capability, Commander. It's about choice. We're here because we want it. The question is, do you? Zalrek's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Kara thought he might lash out. Instead, he leaned back, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the room. Want it? He repeated, his tone almost contemplative. Perhaps. But I do not trust it. Your kind speaks of peace while building weapons in the shadows. You tell stories of survival, but they are stories of war. You ask for trust, but your actions scream otherwise. Kara didn't flinch. Trust has to start somewhere. We've both lost too much in this war, Zalrek. Continuing it would only ensure that neither of our species has a future. Zalrek studied her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. Then, he spoke, his voice quieter but no less intense. And what future do you envision, Captain? One where our children grow up side by side? Where CERN and humans share resources, trade, perhaps even live on the same planets? His tone turned sharp, almost mocking. Do you truly believe such coexistence is possible? I believe it has to be, Kara replied without hesitation. Because the alternative is extinction, for both of us. The room fell silent again. The other delegates, human and CERN alike, watched the exchange with bated breath, their own input forgotten in the shadow of the two leaders' clash. Zalrek's claws tapped against the table once, twice, before he leaned forward. There is a story I've never told a human, he said, his voice low. Kara raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. It was early in the war, Zalrek began, his tone heavy with memory. Your kind was still unknown to us. We saw you as primitive, disorganized. Easy prey. He paused, his gaze distant. I led an assault on one of your colonies, Epsilon Eridani 4. It was a small outpost, barely defended. Or so we thought. Kara knew the name. Epsilon Eridani 4 had been one of the first colonies to fall in the war. What little she'd read about it painted a grim picture. We landed without resistance, Zalrek continued. The settlement was deserted. No soldiers, no civilians. Just silence. My troops spread out, searching for signs of life. And then... He trailed off, his claws curling slightly. And then? Kara prompted. They came from beneath the ground, Zalrek said, his voice tightening. Farmers. Miners. Children. Armed with crude weapons and explosives. They tore through my troops like rabid beasts. It wasn't war, it was chaos. His eyes locked onto hers, the memory burning in his gaze. We were not prepared for that kind of savagery. It was not strategy. It was instinct. Survival at any cost. Kara felt a chill run down her spine. She could picture it vividly, desperate colonists turning their home into a battlefield, fighting with nothing to lose. We won, of course, Vraxx said, his voice hardening. But at a cost. I lost more troops that day than I had in any battle before it. And I realized something: humans are not like us. You do not fight for glory or conquest. You fight because you cannot imagine defeat. Kara's voice was steady when she spoke. And that scares you? Vraxx didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice was almost a whisper. It does. The admission hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Kara leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Vraxx. Fear doesn't have to lead to war, Vraxx. It can lead to understanding. To compromise. You fear what we're capable of. Good. Use that fear to make the right choice. End this war before it destroys us both. Vraxx's claws flexed against the table, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Kara thought she'd gotten through to him. But then his gaze hardened, and he stood abruptly. This discussion is over, he said, his voice cold. Vraxx. No. He turned to face her fully, his massive frame towering over her. You may speak of peace, Captain, but your kind's history tells a different story. You thrive in chaos. You are chaos. I will not gamble the future of my people on your promises. Kara stood as well, her fists clenched at her sides. And I won't let you drag us back into the darkness, Vraxx. If you walk away from this, you're choosing war. Is that what you want? More death? More destruction? Vraxx's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Instead, he turned and strode toward the door, his footsteps echoing like thunder. Kara watched him go, her chest tight with frustration and dread. She wanted to scream, to shout, to do something to stop him. But she knew better. Words alone wouldn't be enough. As the doors slid shut behind Vraxx, Kara sat back down, her hands trembling slightly. Max, who had been silent throughout the exchange, leaned in. That didn't go well. No, Kara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But it's not over. Max frowned. You really think he'll come around? Kara looked toward the door, her expression grim. I think he's scared. And scared people make mistakes. The question is, what kind of mistake will he make? On the CERN flagship, Vraxx stood in his private chamber, staring out at the stars. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He wanted to believe that peace was possible, but every instinct, every lesson he'd learned on the battlefield, told him otherwise. Commander, Zalvir's voice came through the calm. The delegation is awaiting your orders. Vraxx closed his eyes, his claws tightening into fists. Tell them to prepare for withdrawal, he said finally. The negotiations are suspended. Yes, Commander. As the calm line went silent, Vraxx opened his eyes, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. He had made his decision. But in the depths of his mind doubt lingered. And it whispered that this war was far from over.